The night his father told him to leave, the wind was strong enough to shake the barn doors off their hinges. It rattled the windows of the farmhouse and sent dry leaves scraping across the yard like restless spirits. He was only 18, old enough to swing a hammer and plow a field, but not old enough, it seemed, to choose who he loved. When the door shut behind him, it did not open again. He stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the worn boards beneath his boots, listening to his mother crying somewhere inside. Then he picked up the small canvas bag he had packed and stepped into the dark. In that small American town, people talked more than they listened. They had already decided who he was and what he had done wrong. Loving a native woman was enough to turn neighbors cold and blood thick as tar. Men who had once slapped his back at the general store now looked past him as if he were a ghost. The preacher had spoken about tradition and order the Sunday before, and everyone knew who he meant. No one said her name out loud anymore, as if silence could erase her. He found her waiting at the edge of town near the old cottonwood tree by the creek. She stood straight, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind, her dark hair moving softly around her shoulders. She had heard what happened. News traveled fast when it carried shame. But there was no shame in her eyes when she looked at him, only worry and something steady beneath it. They made their choice, he told her, his voice steady even though his chest felt hollow. Now I'll make mine. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were warm despite the cold night. They did not need many words. In a place where words had been used as weapons, silence between them felt honest. They walked for hours under a sky full of hard stars. By morning, they were far enough from town that the church bell could not reach them. The land changed as they went, fields giving way to tall pines and uneven ground. The American frontier still held pockets of wild country where a man and woman could disappear if they had the courage. They had little money. He counted it 3 times as they sat on a fallen log by the road. It came to just over $7. 2 of those dollars would need to be saved for food. That left 5. It was an old trapper who told them about the shack. The man smelled of tobacco and wood smoke and spoke as if every sentence cost him effort. He said there was a place deep in the forest, left behind years ago when a mining crew packed up and vanished. The roof leaked and the door hung crooked, but it stood. The land around it was no one's concern. $5 and it would be theirs. They followed his directions through thick trees and over rocky ground. When they found it, she stopped walking. The shack leaned like it was tired of standing. The boards were gray and split. One shutter dangled by a single rusted hinge. The tin roof was patched with mismatched sheets that flashed dull silver in the sun. It looked more like a mistake than a home. He studied it in silence, then he looked at her. It's not much, he said. She gave a small smile. It's ours. He paid the trapper with wrinkled bills, and just like that, at 18 years old, he owned a $5 shack in the middle of nowhere. The first nights were cold. The wind slipped through cracks in the walls and whispered across the floor. They slept wrapped in blankets beside a small fire he built in a stone ring just outside. Inside, the air smelled of old dust and damp wood. There were marks carved into one wall, long lines grouped in 5s, as if someone had once counted days there. They worked from sunrise to sunset. He cut fallen branches and patched the roof as best he could. She cleaned the inside, sweeping out years of dirt and leaves. Together they found an old iron stove tucked in one corner under a pile of broken boards. It took 2 days to drag it upright and clear the pipe, but when the first fire burned inside it, the shack felt less like a ruin and more like a beginning. Life was hard, but it was honest. He trapped small game and fished in the creek. She planted a small garden near the back where sunlight broke through the trees. In the evenings, they sat on the rough steps and watched the sky turn gold and then deep blue. Sometimes he would catch her staring at the horizon, her face thoughtful. "Do you miss it?" he asked once, meaning her people, her old home. "I carry it with me," she answered, touching her chest. "No one can take that." The town they left behind might as well have been another world. Out here, there were no whispers, no narrow looks. Only the forest, the wind, and the sound of their own breathing. Yet even in the quiet, something about the shack felt unsettled. It started with the floor. One afternoon, as he hammered a loose plank back into place, the wood beneath his knee gave a hollow sound. Not the dull thud of solid ground, but something deeper. He knocked again, hollow. He frowned and pressed his ear close. For a moment, he thought he heard something shift below, like a faint scrape. He told himself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon that had found shelter under the cabin. Still, the feeling lingered. That night, as they lay on their blankets, he heard it again. A soft thump beneath the boards. She stirred beside him. "You heard that," she whispered. He nodded. The next morning, he stepped outside and walked around the shack, looking for any opening beneath it. The structure sat low, almost flat against the ground. There was no visible crawl space, no obvious gap where animals could enter. The earth around it was packed tight and covered with pine needles. He grabbed a shovel. It took hours to clear a narrow strip along one side. Sweat soaked his shirt and dirt packed under his nails. Finally, the blade of the shovel struck something solid. Not rock, wood. He brushed away the soil with his hands and uncovered a thick wooden beam running beneath the cabin. It looked deliberate, too straight and too smooth to be natural. She knelt beside him, her eyes sharp. "This place was built higher once," she said quietly. Then lowered. He studied the foundation. The beams formed a frame beneath the shack, raising it just enough to hide something below. But what? They returned inside and examined the floor more carefully. The hollow sound was strongest near the center of the room. He pried up one narrow plank, the nails squealing in protest. Beneath it was darkness. He held a lantern over the opening. There was space under the cabin. Not just a shallow gap, but a hollow large enough for a man to crouch. The light flickered against packed earth walls and something else. A corner of metal, barely visible. He felt a chill move up his spine. "Stay here," he said softly. She shook her head. "No." He widened the opening and lowered himself down, boots sinking slightly into cool soil. The air beneath the shack was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and something metallic. He raised the lantern higher. Wooden crates sat stacked against one side, half covered by a torn canvas. They were not rotted through. They had been sealed tight. Beside them stood a small chest bound in iron straps. The metal corner he had seen belonged to it. He swallowed hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forest outside seemed far away, as if the world had narrowed to that hidden space. "Why would someone hide this?" she asked quietly from above. He stepped closer to the crates and brushed dirt from the top. Faint lettering appeared. The words were worn, but he could make out part of a name and a year from decades ago. The same year he realized that the mining crew had supposedly vanished. His mind raced. Gold, tools, something stolen, or something worse. He reached for the iron chest. The lock was old but solid. It would not open without force. As he stood there in the lantern glow, he felt the weight of what this could mean. $5 had bought them more than a roof and 4 walls. It had bought them a secret buried beneath the floorboards, a secret someone might still be looking for. He climbed back up and replaced the plank loosely, covering the opening for now. They sat together in the dim light of the shack, the silence thick. "If anyone else knows," she said, "they may come." He nodded. The town had cast him out with nothing. Now, hidden beneath their new home was something that could change everything. Or destroy it. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long between the trees, he stepped outside to clear his head. The air felt different, heavier. He scanned the tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shape slipping between trunks. Too tall for a deer, too deliberate for the wind. His hand tightened around the axe he carried. From inside the shack, she called his name softly. He did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the forest. The shape had vanished, but the feeling remained. Someone new. He turned slowly back toward the crooked door of the $5 shack, toward the woman who had chosen him when the world had not. Beneath their feet lay whatever the miners had hidden all those years ago. And somewhere beyond the trees, unseen eyes might already be watching, waiting for the right moment to claim what lay under that weathered floor. He stepped inside and barred the door, the sound of the wooden beam sliding into place echoing through the small room. The lantern flame flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Under the shack, the darkness held its breath. The lantern burned low that night, and neither of them slept much. Every small sound felt sharper than it should have. The pop of cooling wood in the stove, the whisper of wind brushing the tin roof, the faint settling of the earth beneath the floorboards. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, counting his own breaths, listening for something that did not belong. Beside him, she was awake too. He could tell by the way her hand rested lightly on his arm, not heavy with sleep, but steady, alert. "You saw someone?" she said quietly. "I'm not sure," he answered. "Could have been my mind playing tricks." She did not argue. She had grown up reading the land, reading silence. She knew the difference between fear and warning. At dawn, he stepped outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder, not to hunt but to look. The forest wore a thin veil of morning mist. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines in pale stripes. He walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the ground. At first he saw nothing unusual. Pine needles, small stones, the soft indentations of his own boots from the day before. Then near the edge of the clearing, just beyond a cluster of low bush, he spotted something that did not match, a footprint. It was not fresh enough to show sharp detail, but it was not old either. The heel was deep, the toe slightly turned out. Larger than hers, not his, he crouched and touched the soil. It was still loose where pressure had been. Whoever had stood there had been watching the shack. He did not call out to her right away. Instead, he followed the faint trail a few yards into the trees. It faded quickly on the harder ground, but the feeling stayed with him. They were not as alone as they thought. When he returned, she was outside feeding small scraps to a pair of birds that had begun visiting the clearing each morning. She looked up at his face and understood before he spoke. "We need to be careful," he said. She nodded. "We always are." They agreed not to speak of the crates loudly. Even the walls felt like they could listen. That day they worked as usual, making no sign that anything had changed. He chopped wood and stacked it neatly. She weeded the garden and checked the small shoots pushing through the soil. If someone was watching, they would see nothing but a young couple trying to survive. But under the surface, their thoughts stayed fixed on the hidden space beneath the shack. Late that afternoon, while she prepared a simple stew on the iron stove, he took out the small bundle of papers he had carried with him since leaving home. Old newspaper clippings his father once saved. Stories about the mining operation that had passed through these woods years ago. He remembered being a boy, sitting at the kitchen table while his father talked about it. The miners had come chasing rumors of silver and gold in the hills. They built temporary cabins, dug deep into the rock, and brought in supplies from town. For a short time, the area buzzed with hope and money. Then something happened. The stories were unclear. Some said the mine collapsed. Others said the ore ran dry and the company pulled out overnight. A few whispered about theft. A shipment that never reached its destination. Men who argued over claims and profits. Within months, the operation vanished. The cabins were abandoned. The forest swallowed the rest. He studied the faded ink, trying to piece it together. One article mentioned a foreman who disappeared just before the camp was deserted. Another hinted at a dispute with local landowners. Nothing proved anything. But it was enough to stir the imagination. She sat across from him, watching his face as he read. "You think it belonged to them," she said. "It has to," he replied. "Those crates, that chest. It matches the year, and if someone else knows where it is," he folded the paper carefully, "then we are sitting on something that could bring trouble." The word trouble hung between them like smoke. Money had never been more than a distant dream for him. Back home, every dollar had been counted and stretched. Owning land, even a leaning shack, felt like a miracle. But the thought of hidden wealth under their floor changed the air in the room. It was no longer just about survival, it was about choice. They could leave it alone, pretend they never found it. Or they could open that chest and see what lay inside. For now, they chose patience. Over the next few days, small signs kept appearing. A snapped twig near the tree line. A stone that had not been there before, resting close to the edge of the clearing. Once, while drawing water from the creek, she felt eyes on her and turned quickly, but saw only trees swaying gently. They began taking turns keeping watch at night. He would sit by the small window with the lantern turned low, listening to the forest. She would rest for a few hours, then wake and take his place. The routine made them tired, but neither complained. On the fourth evening after discovering the space beneath the shack, a sound broke the quiet just after sunset. A distant crack. Not the sharp echo of a rifle, but the heavy snap of wood under weight. He stiffened and motioned for silence. The sound had come from the north side of the clearing, near the narrow path that led deeper into the forest. Minutes passed. Then another sound, softer this time, like a boot shifting on leaves. He moved slowly toward the door and eased it open just enough to see outside. The sky was darkening, the last light fading behind the trees. At first he saw nothing. Then a shadow detached itself from the trunk of a pine. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, not stepping forward, not retreating, just watching. His heart pounded, but he forced his voice steady. "You lost?" The figure did not answer. For a long moment they stared at each other across the distance. He could not make out the face clearly, only the outline of a man wearing a hat pulled low. Finally, the stranger spoke. "Didn't know anyone was living out here." "We are," he replied, a pause. "Then, that's so?" The man shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the shack as if measuring it. "Just passing through," the stranger added. "Old place." "Yes," he said, "old." The silence stretched thin. Then, without another word, the figure turned and walked back into the trees. He waited until the forest swallowed the sound of footsteps before closing the door. She looked at him, her expression tight. He was not just passing through. No, they both knew it. The next morning he found fresh tracks near the same spot as before, this time clearer. The man had returned after dark and circled closer to the shack than he had realized. Anger flickered in his chest. This was their home. Small and broken, but theirs. That afternoon he decided to learn more. He walked to the nearest settlement, a rough cluster of buildings nearly 10 miles away. It was smaller than the town he had left, but large enough to hold a trading post and a few weathered houses. People there minded their own business more often than not. Inside the trading post, he kept his voice casual. "Anyone been asking about an old mining shack north of here?" he asked the storekeeper while pretending to examine a coil of rope. The storekeeper, a narrow man with sharp eyes, studied him. "Why?" "Just curious. Heard stories," the man shrugged. "Stories are cheap. But I've seen a fellow asking about abandoned claims. Says he's looking to buy land. Been around these parts a week or two. Know his name? Didn't offer it. Didn't look like a buyer to me. Looked like a man searching for something already promised." A chill ran through him. He bought a small bag of flour and headed back before dusk. The walk felt longer than usual. Every rustle in the underbrush made him turn. When he reached the clearing, she was standing outside waiting. Relief crossed her face when she saw him. "He came back," she said quietly, "not into the clearing. Just close enough to let me know." He set the flour down and looked toward the trees. The air felt heavy again, as if holding secrets. That night, after they barred the door, he lifted the loose plank once more. The lantern light spilled into the hidden space. The crate sat unchanged, silent and patient. "We cannot keep pretending," he said softly. "If he is searching, he may already suspect." She met his gaze. "And if we open it, there is no going back." He climbed down carefully, feeling the packed earth under his boots. The iron chest waited in the corner, stubborn and still. He ran his hand over the cold metal. For a moment, he imagined gold coins spilling out, enough to buy land far from prejudice and whispers, enough to build a proper house, enough to give her the security she deserved. But he also imagined something else: documents, deeds, evidence of a claim that someone else believed was theirs. A reason for men to threaten and fight. Above him, she held the lantern steady, her face glowing in the warm light. "Whatever it is," she said, "we face it together." He nodded. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rattling the loose tin sheets on the roof. It sounded almost like footsteps circling the shack. He set his jaw and reached for a heavy stone he had brought down earlier. The lock would not survive a strong blow. For a second he hesitated, listening. From somewhere beyond the walls, faint but clear, came the crunch of boots on gravel, not one pair. More than one. His grip tightened on the stone as the sound drew closer, stopping just outside their door. The boots stopped right outside the door. He did not breathe. The stone felt heavy in his hand down in the hidden space, and he slowly lowered it to the dirt. Above him, she shifted the lantern so the light would not spill through the cracks in the floorboards. The small shack, which once felt like a refuge, now felt thin as paper, a knuckle rapped against the door. Not hard, just enough. He climbed up quietly and slid the plank back into place. She stepped away from the opening and set the lantern on the table, turning the flame down low. The knock came again, this time firmer. "Open up," a voice called, not loud but certain. He barred the trapdoor plank with his foot for a second, as if that could protect what lay beneath, then moved toward the main door. He lifted the wooden beam and opened it just a crack. Two men stood in the fading light. The one he had seen before with the low hat stood slightly ahead. The other was broader, with a thick coat and eyes that did not wander. They both looked past him, scanning the inside of the shack without asking. "Evening," the man in the hat said. His tone was polite, but his gaze was not. "What do you want?" he asked. "Just talking. We're looking into old claims in this area. Heard there was a cabin out here. Thought we'd take a look. It's ours," he said. "Bought it fair? From who? A trapper?" The broad man gave a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Paper on that purchase?" "No paper." "Just $5 and a handshake." The two men exchanged a glance. The one in the hat stepped a little closer. $5 for land with history. That's a bargain. He kept his body angled to block their view. "It was abandoned." "So we heard," the man replied. "Abandoned things have a way of being found." Silence stretched between them. He could feel her presence behind him, steady as ever, though he knew her heart must be racing too. "We don't want trouble," he said. "Neither do we," the broad man answered. "We're businessmen." The word felt wrong in the forest clearing, like a polished shoe in mud. "Mind if we look around?" the man in the hat asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. The answer hung there. The politeness slipped from their faces for just a second before returning. "Suit yourself," the man said. "We'll be back through. This land may not be as free as you think." They turned and walked away, not hurried, not afraid, just confident. He closed the door and dropped the beam back into place. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The stove crackled softly, the only sound inside. "They know," she said at last. "Yes." She moved closer to him, lowering her voice even though the men were gone. "This is not just curiosity. They are searching for something specific," he nodded. "And they believe it's here." The next morning, he rose before sunrise and walked to the outer edge of the clearing again. The men had circled the shack in the night. He found tracks on 3 sides this time. They had tested the ground near the back wall, as if checking for loose soil. He crouched and ran his fingers over the dirt where they had pressed their boots. Anger and fear tangled in his chest. He had been cast out for loving her. He had scraped together $5 to build a life from nothing. Now strangers wanted to take that too. When he returned inside, she was sitting at the small table with a folded piece of cloth in her hands. It was an old woven pattern from her family, something she had carried since they left her home. She smoothed it carefully. "My uncle used to tell stories about miners," she said quietly, "about how they dug into land that did not belong to them, promised wealth, left scars." He sat across from her. "You think what's under us is stolen. I think someone believed it was theirs, and someone else believed the same." The conflict was no longer just about money. It was about land, history, and claims written and unwritten. The hidden chest beneath their floor was tied to something larger than their small shack. That afternoon, a different visitor came. An older man approached from the south path, walking slowly with a cane. He wore no hat and made no effort to hide his presence. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped and waited. He stepped outside to meet him. "You the young fellow staying here?" the old man asked. "Yes." The man nodded toward the shack. "I remember when that was raised. I was a boy then. Mining crew built it quick." "Too quick. You know what happened?" he asked. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "I know men fought over more than ore. Some said a shipment went missing before the company packed up. Some said the foreman hid it, planning to come back." "And did he—" "No." The old man tapped his cane against the ground. "Men have been sniffing around these woods for years. Most give up. But every so often someone comes convinced they're the one who will find what was buried." A long pause followed. If you found something, the old man added carefully, be sure you understand its weight. He left as quietly as he had come. That evening she seemed thoughtful, quieter than usual. While he repaired a loose board on the outer wall, she walked to the creek alone. The sound of water usually calmed her, today it did not. She remembered the way people in town had looked at her, the way they had spoken about her people as if they were shadows instead of neighbors. Now, strangers were circling their home with that same sense of entitlement. When she returned, she carried more than water. She carried resolve. We cannot wait for them to decide our future, she said. He knew what she meant, the chest. Night fell quickly, heavy clouds covering the stars. The forest seemed closer than before, pressing in around the shack. They moved the table aside and lifted the loose plank again. He lowered himself into the hidden space while she handed down the lantern. The air felt tighter, as if it too sensed time running thin. He knelt before the iron chest. Before striking the lock, he examined the crates more closely. One had a split corner where the wood had dried and cracked. He pried gently at the gap and saw cloth inside. Thick canvas bags, tied at the top. He cut one open carefully. Inside were metal pieces wrapped in paper, not coins, not gold bars. Machinery parts. Small but heavy, each stamped with a mark he did not recognize. Not treasure, he whispered up to her. What then? I don't know. He set the bag aside and turned to the chest. The lock was old but sturdy. He lifted the stone and brought it down hard. The first strike dented it. The second cracked it. The third broke it free. The sound echoed louder than he expected. They froze, listening. No footsteps, not yet. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath them, a smaller wooden box. His heart sank and raced at the same time. Paper could be more powerful than gold. He unwrapped one bundle, maps, hand-drawn lines marking claims in the hills, names written in faded ink. Some crossed out, some circled. One name appeared repeatedly, larger than the rest. He did not recognize it. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. These are land claims. Yes, he opened the smaller wooden box. Inside were silver coins stacked neatly. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Above them, the shack creaked. He closed the chest halfway, instinct taking over. From outside came the unmistakable sound of a hand sliding along the outer wall, testing it. They looked at each other. The men had returned. This time there was no knock. Instead, a voice carried through the thin boards. We know you're in there. His pulse thundered in his ears. He lowered the lid quietly and blew out the lantern beneath the floor, plunging the space into darkness. Only the faint light from above filtered through cracks. Boots moved around the shack again. One stopped near the back wall, right above the hidden space. Young man, the voice called, calmer than before. This doesn't need to be difficult. She stood above, her posture straight despite the fear pressing in. He climbed up slowly and replaced the plank, covering the opening once more. The maps and coins lay hidden again, but not safe. When he stepped toward the door, she caught his hand. They will not stop, she whispered. No, he agreed. They won't. The handle of the door rattled under pressure from outside. The $5 shack that once seemed like a blessing now stood at the center of a storm. Beneath its floor lay disputed claims, silver coins, and proof of a past that powerful men might kill to control. Around it moved strangers who believed the land and its secrets were already theirs. Inside, two young people who had been pushed out by prejudice now faced a different kind of battle. Not just for love, but for ownership, history, and survival. The door shook harder. And this time, the wooden beam began to splinter. The wooden beam cracked with a sharp snap that seemed louder than a gunshot in the tight space. Dust drifted down from the top of the door frame. She stepped back from the table, her face pale but steady. He pressed his shoulder against the door, bracing it as another heavy shove rattled the hinges. This is your last chance, the voice outside called. It was not angry. It was controlled, which made it worse. He looked at her, and in that split second they understood each other without words. The shack was small. If the door gave way, there would be no room to run. No place to hide except beneath the floor, and that would only trap them. He leaned closer to her and spoke low. Trapdoor, she nodded and moved fast but quiet. While he kept his weight against the door, she dragged the table back into place over the loose plank. The men outside shoved again. The beam splintered further, wood fibers stretching like strained rope. He pulled away at the last moment and lifted the bar completely. The sudden release surprised the men, and the door swung inward hard. The broad one stumbled a step inside before catching himself. The man in the hat stood just behind him, eyes sweeping the room. He raised his hand slowly, empty. "No need to break my door," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "We were going to talk." The broad man looked around the shack. His gaze lingered on the stove, the bedrolls, the patched walls. Then it dropped to the floorboards for just a second too long. "You been doing any digging?" the man in the hat asked. "Just planting," he replied. "Trying to grow something." The man stepped fully inside now, boots thudding on the worn boards. She stood near the stove, hands folded, watching every movement. "We've spent time and money tracking what was taken from this land," the hat man said. "That chest belongs to investors." "Not to you?" The word chest landed like a stone in still water. He did not let his face change. "I don't know what you're talking about." The broad man moved toward the center of the room and stamped his heel once on the floor. The hollow sound betrayed them. All three men froze for half a heartbeat. The broad man smiled slowly. "Hear that?" The air thickened. He felt heat rise in his chest, not just fear but defiance. They had been pushed out once before. He would not step aside again. "This shack was abandoned," he said. "You said so yourself?" "Abandoned does not mean unclaimed," the hat man replied. "We have papers. Show them." The man's jaw tightened. "That's not how this works." Outside, the wind picked up, whipping through the trees and rattling the tin roof. The storm that had been building all day finally broke with a low roll of thunder in the distance. She stepped forward then, her voice clear. "If you have papers, bring them. If you have proof, show it. Otherwise, you are trespassing." The broad man turned toward her, surprised by the firmness in her tone. For a second, something almost like respect flickered in his expression. The hat man's patience thinned. "Move the table." "No," he said. Another rumble of thunder rolled closer. The hat man took one step toward the center of the room. He did not touch anyone. He did not raise a hand. But the threat was plain. "You are young," he said. "You do not understand what you are involved in. That mine was financed by powerful men. That chest was hidden before the claims were settled. If word spreads that it has been found, others will come. You think we are the only ones searching." The word sank in. Others. The clearing might already be known to more than just these two. Lightning flashed outside, bright enough to light the inside of the shack for a heartbeat. In that flash, he saw something else in the hat man's eyes. "Not just greed? Urgency? You're afraid someone else will get here first," he said quietly. The man did not answer. Rain began to fall, heavy drops striking the roof in uneven rhythm. Water slipped through the patched tin in thin lines. The storm wrapped around the shack like a curtain. He took a slow breath. "You break this place apart and you bring attention. Noise travels. You said it yourself. Others are looking." The broad man glanced toward the door, then back at the floor. Silence stretched. "We can settle this simple," the hat man said finally. "You walk away. Take what you brought. Leave the shack. Leave what's under it. We forget you were ever here." The offer hung between them. $5 had bought the shack. Sweat and long days had made it a home. Beneath it lay maps, silver coins, and something larger than money. It was not just about profit now. It was about whether they would always be the ones pushed aside. She moved closer to him until their shoulders nearly touched. "This land was taken before," she said quietly. "From people who never saw it returned?" The hat man's expression hardened. "That was long before you. It is never long before," she replied. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. For a moment, no one moved. Rainwater dripped through a small hole near the stove, capping against the floor in a steady beat. Then, from outside, another sound cut through the storm, voices, more than two. The broad man turned sharply toward the door. The hat man's eyes narrowed. Boots splashed through mud near the clearing. A lantern glow flickered through the rain, approaching fast. "You expecting company?" he asked. "No," he answered honestly. The newcomers did not knock. They pushed through the rain straight toward the open doorway. 3 figures emerged, soaked but determined. One of them held up a folded paper wrapped in oilskin. The old man with the cane stepped into view behind them. "That's far enough," the old man said, his voice thin but firm. "We heard shouting," the hat man swore under his breath. The man holding the oilskin unwrapped it carefully despite the rain. "You've been waving around talk of papers," he said to the hat man. "Let's see them." The tension in the room shifted, but it did not ease. If anything, it sharpened. Now there were more eyes, more interests, more possibilities. The broad man moved slightly to block the view of the floorboards, but it was too late. One of the newcomers had already noticed the hollow sound underfoot. "What's under there?" he asked. The rain intensified, drumming harder on the roof. Water began to pool near the doorway. He felt the moment tipping, balance teetering on a knife edge. Too many men, too many claims. Too much history pressing into one small wooden shack. The old man stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I told you boys years ago that digging up ghosts would bring trouble." The hat man shot him a look. "Stay out of this. It stopped being just your business when you started breaking doors," the old man replied. Lightning flashed again, followed almost instantly by thunder. The storm seemed to echo the rising conflict inside. He looked at her. Her jaw was set, eyes bright despite the fear. Slowly he reached down and slid the table aside himself. Gasps and sharp breaths filled the room as he pried up the loose plank. "If we are going to talk about claims," he said, "then we talk about all of them." He dropped down into the hidden space and lifted the iron chest up enough for the others to see. Muddy boots crowded closer to the opening. Lantern light flickered over old maps and bundles of documents. The man with the oilskin paper knelt. "That seal," he whispered. "I've seen it before." The hat man's face went pale for the first time. Outside, the storm raged, wind bending the trees around the clearing. The shack creaked but held. Inside, history lay exposed at last. Land claims, names, signatures, evidence of deals made and broken. He climbed back up, standing between the chest and the others. "No one takes anything tonight?" he said. "Not until this is settled in the open." The broad man looked ready to argue, but the hat man held up a hand. More thunder rolled, shaking the walls. The old man leaned closer to the maps, his eyes scanning quickly. "If these are what I think they are," he murmured, "then this land was never properly signed over." The words changed everything. Faces shifted from greed to calculation. Rain poured harder, forcing everyone further inside. The small shack that once barely held 2 now held a storm of men, history, and unfinished business. He felt her hand find his. The climax was close. He could feel it in the air, thick as the humidity before lightning strikes. Outside, the forest stood witness. Inside, the truth waited in faded ink and silver stacks. And as the thunder crashed once more overhead, every man in that room understood that whatever happened next would decide not only who owned the $5 shack, but who finally had the right to stand on that land without being pushed away. The thunder rolled away slowly, like a heavy cart fading down a dirt road. Rain still pounded the tin roof, but inside the shack, no one moved for a long moment. The iron chest sat open between them, lantern light dancing across old maps, faded land claims, assumptions made decades ago. The old man with the cane lowered himself carefully onto a crate and picked up one of the oil-wrapped documents. His fingers trembled, not from fear but from age and memory. "I was there when they argued," he said quietly. "The foreman and the backers from town. The miners found more than silver. They found proof that this land was already registered under a different survey, a mistake in the boundary lines. If this is what I think it is, they hid these papers because they showed the investors never legally owned the claim." The hat man's jaw tightened. "That's one version hoping to be true." The man with the oilskin unrolled his own paper beside the maps from the chest. "This is the updated county survey from years back. The northern boundary shifted after the dispute, but the transfer was never finalized." He looked up slowly at the young man and the woman. "If these maps are authentic, this shack sits on land that was never properly claimed by the mining company." Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy with threat, but heavy with realization. The broad man wiped rain from his forehead. "You're saying the company had no legal right to what they dug." "I'm saying," the older man replied, "that the fight was over a mistake." And when they realized the mistake would cost them money, they walked away instead of admitting it. The Hat Man's shoulders sagged slightly. Not in defeat, but in the slow acceptance that his search had been built on a shaky foundation. He looked at the young couple. Even if that's true, the chest contains company property. Coins left behind in a hidden space, the man with the survey said. After decades, without claim. Without record, the rain began to soften. The storm was moving on. The young man stood straight, though his heart still pounded. We didn't steal anything. We bought an abandoned shack for $5. We fixed it, we planted here. We built a life here. He glanced at the woman beside him. She held his hand firmly, not for support, but as a reminder. We're not asking for gold or fortune, he continued. We're asking to stay on land no one else wanted until they smelled money. The old man tapped his cane once. And if these documents prove the land was never lawfully signed away, then the claim can be reopened properly. In daylight. In town. With witnesses. The Hat Man stared at the chest, at the maps that had fueled years of quiet searching. His ambition had led him through forests and old rumors. Now it stood face to face with a truth that did not match the legend. Finally, he spoke. If this goes to town, it won't be quiet. Good, she said softly. Let it not be quiet? Her voice carried a strength that surprised even some of the men in the room. It was not anger, it was dignity. The broad man shifted his weight. We came here thinking we'd found a hidden treasure. Instead, seeing we found paperwork. The corners of the old man's mouth twitched slightly. Paper is heavier than silver, son. One by one, the tension eased from the room. No one reached for the chest. No one tried to push past another. The storm had broken something more than the air. They agreed to take the documents into town at first light. Not just the Hat Man and his partner, but the older man and the survey holder as witnesses. The chest would remain in the shack overnight, closed but not hidden, no one argued. When the last rumble of thunder faded into the hills, the extra men stepped back into the damp clearing. The Hat Man paused at the doorway. I was wrong about you, he said, not quite meeting the young man's eyes. You're not hiding treasure. He gave a short nod. You're protecting it. The forest swallowed their figures as they left. Inside the shack, quiet returned slowly. Water dripped from the roof in steady rhythm. The lantern flame flickered low. He closed the chest carefully and set it back beneath the floor, but not in secrecy this time, just in safekeeping. When the plank was replaced, he sat down heavily on the edge of the bedroll. The weight of the night finally reached him. She knelt in front of him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. You stood your ground, she said. So did you? They both smiled, small but real. At dawn, mist rose from the forest floor like breath. The clearing looked washed clean. The storm had knocked loose branches from trees, but the shack still stood. They walked to town with the documents wrapped tight in oilcloth. The Hat Man and the broad one walked ahead. The old man with the cane kept steady pace. Word spread quickly as they reached the trading post. People gathered, curious. In the center of town, under open sky, the maps were laid out on a wooden table. Lines were compared, signatures examined, dates matched. Voices rose and fell, but not in anger. In focus. By midday, it became clear. The mining company had overstepped the boundary decades ago. When the error surfaced, instead of correcting it publicly, they had buried the proof and abandoned the site. The land beneath the shack had never legally transferred to them. Without an official claimant and with proof of purchase from the trapper who had held informal rights for years, the path opened. The county clerk, an older woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, stamped a temporary claim notice. Until a formal survey confirms, she said, this land rests under your name. He stared at the paper in disbelief. Her hand squeezed his. It was not gold that secured their future. It was truth brought into light. In the weeks that followed, the forest clearing changed in quiet ways. A proper survey team came through, measuring and marking boundaries. The shack was reinforced, lifted slightly, and set on stronger beams. What once hid secrets now supported new floors. The silver coins from the chest were counted publicly and logged. A portion went to cover survey costs. A portion was donated to the town for repairs to the old bridge. The rest was modest, but enough to buy tools and seed. The machinery parts turned out to be early mining components, rare but not priceless. A collector from a nearby city purchased them legally, the transaction recorded and witnessed. Nothing was hidden anymore. The Hat Man returned once, not as a rival but as a visitor. He tipped his hat and admitted that the search had taught him more about pride than profit. He invested in a legitimate claim elsewhere, this time with clear records. The broad man helped reinforce the shack one afternoon without being asked. As for the old man with the cane, he visited often, sitting on the repaired porch and telling stories of the early days, stories now free of half-truths. The town's whispers shifted too. News of the land dispute and its fair resolution traveled. The same people who once turned cold began to look differently at the young couple who had stood firm without bitterness. Prejudice does not vanish overnight, but respect can begin in a single moment of courage. Seasons changed. The small garden grew into a steady patch of vegetables. A proper fence lined the clearing. Smoke from the stove rose straight into clear skies. The $5 shack, once leaning and forgotten, became a symbol in quiet conversations. Not of hidden treasure, but of perseverance, of love that endured exile, of standing on land and saying calmly and firmly, "We belong here." On an autumn evening, as golden light filtered through the pines, he stood beside her on the porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. "When I was kicked out?" She nodded. "It led us here." He looked at the sturdy walls around them, the land stretching peacefully beyond. "They never saw what was under it," he said softly. She smiled. "Not just the chest. Under that shack had been buried more than maps and coins. There had been proof of injustice, proof of oversight, and proof that truth, when brought into daylight, can change the course of a life. The real foundation of their home was not timber or stone, it was choice. He chose love over fear, she chose courage over silence. Together, they chose not to run when pressure came. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, just as he had the first day they stood before the broken shack. Only now the roof did not sag, the door did not splinter, and the ground beneath their feet was no longer uncertain. The forest stood quiet around them, not watching with suspicion but resting in peace. A $5 shack had given them more than shelter. It had given them a story that would outlast storms, rumors, and doubt. And this time, when the wind rose through the trees, it did not sound like warning. It sounded like home.